Right at the end of last month, that's August of 2022, I wrote an advisory on Sage City talking about the impact of the end of support for basic authentication on Sage CRM's integration with Microsoft Exchange Online. And that's essentially all about something called the deprecation or the end of inclusion of basic authentication and the rise of something called OAuth 2. And I thought it would be useful to include in today's sessions really an overview about what we mean by basic authentication, what we mean by OAuth 2, and making sure that everyone understands why we've done or why we're doing some of the things that we're doing within Sage CRM. So here, I'm going to start off by looking at the idea about understanding OAuth 2. Now, we started, and we, Sage and Sage CRM's development team, started the move to OAuth 2 really back in, we started it in the development cycle of 2020 R1, but we implemented it in with 2020 R2, our first bit of authentication via OAuth 2, and that was for our integration with Exchange at the level of the Exchange Web Services. Now, we'll probably touch on something called TLS as well, because this is security related and it's affecting not just Sage CRM, or it's not just affected Sage CRM, but it's also in the minds of everyone who is using any of Sage product within an on-premise environment, because it is really to do with the way in which we work. So let's start with, first of all, what we mean by basic authentication. Basic authentication is it's old school identification verification. You ask for your username and your password. So you provide the username and password, and there might actually be another check, like making sure that you're coming in over from a particular IP address as well. But it's not really, it doesn't have a two-step process of checking who you are. And what's more, all you need is the username and password, and then you're in. And you're in to that target system as that person with full authority. So it is all about the idea that when you use basic authentication, you are logging on as that person and you have full trust given to you, full control. That's not the same for OAuth 2, which is a type of delegated authority that requires on an additional authority to provide who you are, and then you don't log on directly to the system, you log on through a set of tokens that give you permission on a time basis. And you might have heard people talking about things like the client ID and the secret, and I'll talk about this in a moment. So, basic authentication is a method for the client, in this case Sage CRM, making a request to provide a user and a password to the target system, in this case Exchange. In basic authentication, the request goes over HTTP. In basic HTTP authentication, the request contains the credentials in a header, and it's just base64 encoding of the ID and password. So basic authentication provides no confidentiality or protection for the transmitted credentials. They are merely encoded in base64 in transit, but they're not encrypted or hashed in any way. Therefore, basic authentication is typically used in conjunction with HTTPS to provide confidentiality, and HTTPS TLS runs over TLS, and you can see that that's one of the things that we may have to touch on in this presentation as well. But so you can see that security changes are a big thing, and Microsoft is adamant that it does not want to use basic authentication to expose Exchange Online, a public-facing system, in that way. So we're using OAuth 2, and this represents a step forward in the use of credentials for the authentication of API service users, and that's what Sage CRM is when it's talking to Exchange. And it's a major advance on basic HTTP access authentication method. How does it work? Well, OAuth 2 works by providing to clients, such as Sage CRM, a secure delegated access to a server resource like Exchange on behalf of a resource owner. It specifies a process for a resource owner to authorize third-party access to their server resources without sharing their credentials. So OAuth 2 essentially allows access tokens to be issued by a third-party application like Sage CRM to Sage CRM by an authorization server with the approval of the resource owner. So basically, in this case, we're using an access token to access the protected resources hosted by the resource server. So we're using a token provided by Sage CRM uses a token provided by one server to access the Exchange server. And the flow is described, as you can see on the screen now. The biggest difference, I think, between basic authentication and OAuth 2 is that when an application logs on with basic authentication, then you are using your credentials directly. Once that application logs on, it has the same rights as the original owner, so to all intents and purposes, it is you. But OAuth 2 uses this idea of secure delegated access, and that is through a token. And once the token is obtained, that token is the symbol that determines what the application can do. It doesn't have owner access. It can only do what you've allowed the application to do. And that's why in the documentations for Sage CRM, we've got all these things about the additional setups of what you have to do when you are configuring Exchange Online to allow Sage CRM to access it. So, with the news that Microsoft announced that effective from October the 1st, 2022, they would begin disabling basic authentication for Outlook, Exchange Web Services, POP, and a host of other protocols within Exchange Online, then what does it mean for Sage CRM? What does it mean for you if you are using a particular version of Sage CRM? Will you still be able to integrate with Exchange Online, and does it have any impact on you if you're using Exchange on-premise, Exchange server within your own managed environment? Well, support for OAuth 2 or modern authentication for specific features has been added into different versions of Sage CRM. We first of all added Exchange integration with OAuth 2 in Sage CRM 2020 R2 onwards. We then added support for OAuth 2 in 2021 R1 for the internal mail manager and the advanced email manager. And then we've added, as we've replaced the Outlook and Classic Lite plugins, we've added support for 2022 R2 around import of contacts and emails. So at the basic level, you need, if you're working with Exchange Online, you need to be on 2021 R1 upwards to be able to ensure that from the 1st of October 2022, you can carry on integrating Sage CRM with Exchange Online. Now, what have we learned? What have we learned in this session? Well, are OAuth 2 and modern authentication the same thing? Yes, they are. I've been blurring the terms. If you're using Exchange Online, will Sage CRM continue to work? Well, yes, but you have to be on 2021 R1 onwards, so make sure that you upgrade. And make sure that your instance of Sage CRM is configured to work with OAuth 2 there. So additional work is needed. If your company is using Exchange on-premise, will Sage CRM continue to work? Yes, you can continue to work with basic authentication. And is modern authentication or OAuth 2 available for Exchange on-premise? No. OAuth 2 is only an authentication option for Exchange Online. It's not available for on-premise. You might have heard of something called modern authentication, which is where you have servers, part of your services for an organization are within the Azure environment and part of it within the context of your own hosted Exchange server. Well, we're going to explore modern hybrid modern authentication in Sage CRM 2023 R1. And lastly, will basic authentication stop working if you're using your own Exchange servers on-premise? No. And in fact, Microsoft advises that developers must use either something called NTLM or basic authentication when connecting to Microsoft Exchange on-premise. The next thing that I want to think about is the support for TLS, Transport Layer Security. And there are a number of different standards in this, and it's quite a hot topic at the moment, affecting not just Sage CRM customers and partners, but also questions around the support for TLS in accounting systems and solutions like Sage 300 and the support for TLS when sending emails. The background to this is, or first of all, what TLS is. TLS stands for Transport Layer Security. It's the protocol that is the successor of SSL, Secure Sockets Layer, and it's the foundation of HTTPS. It's the S in there. So it's the protocol used to encrypt communications between websites and users. TLS is also used for securing other transmission protocols such as POP3, IMAPS, and SMTPS. S is the bit where if you're sending or receiving anything, you want the S bit there because that indicates the security standard. We tend to still call we still tend to call the security SSL, but it isn't. It is this TLS, Transport Layer Security. The original TLS was first published in January 1999. TLS 1.1 arrived in 2006, and TLS 1.2 arrived in 2008. The whole background to this is that the Internet Engineering Task Force, IETF, announced that it no longer recommends the use of older TLS versions, and the great switch off for TLS 1.0 and 1.1 began early in 2020. Now, different dates have been announced for different bits of software and components. COVID has delayed the implementation of some of these changes, but there is a consensus that only TLS 1.2 onwards should be supported. And TLS actually is one of the things that Sage CRM has a very good support strategy for. Sage CRM ended support for TLS 1.1 in Sage CRM 2018 R2. We ensured that in Sage CRM 2020 R2, there was no dependency on TLS 1.1. So at the end of 2020, we released a whole set of patches to make sure that everything was supported from September 2020 would be fully compliant with TLS 1.2. So all in all, if you hear any fusses around TLS, we are safe and secure. So hopefully this has been a good session to explain where we are with OAuth 2 and TLS as well. Thank you very much for listening. Bye-bye.